Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Leaders and delegations from throughout the Western Hemisphere arrived in Los Angeles this week for the Summit of the Americas. Even before the event kicked off, it was already embroiled in controversy as Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela were not invited, prompting Mexican President Manuel Lopez Obrador to skip the gathering. So what's on the agenda of the high-profile summit? What does Mexico's absence mean to the gathering, as well as U.S. influences in the region? To explore these questions and more, I'm joined today by Laura Carlsen, Director of the Americas Program for the Center of International Policy in Mexico City, Maricruz Magowan, Vice President of the National Economists Club, Charles Tang, Chairman of Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Professor Jiang Shixue from Shanghai University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Okay, welcome to the discussion. Laura, I will start with you. This is the 9th Summit of Americas. So tell us, what is the Summit of America? What is the purpose of such a gathering?
This has been going on, as we know, since 1994, and the purpose is to unite the region with a plan to confront some of the major issues. These have always been a stage for certain types of conflicts, and sometimes for showing unity as well. But we've seen a number of showdowns in the summits, and so it's kind of a risky thing for the United States, which uses these summits in order to oftentimes impose a US-led agenda. We saw the failure of the summit in 2005 when the United States attempted to impose a free trade agreement of the Americas, and there was a rebellion by South American countries. And in this one, we're also seeing a certain type of a rebellion, and that is the refusal of several leaders, important key leaders in the continent, to attend as a result of the exclusion of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So once again, what we're seeing is this situation set up where the United States has a very specific agenda in mind. The president wants to demonstrate leadership, and yet there are differences of opinion within the continent, and this is not really a forum in which those differences can be resolved. This has been really the key problem at the root of these summits, that there isn't really a dialogue space open for looking at how to confront problems, but rather a US-led agenda that's either accepted or rejected by other countries.
Mm-hmm. Charles, obviously, this gathering, even before it is started, it was overshadowed by this controversy, as we said, because of the lack of invite to the three countries, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. So what do you make of this controversy, or say the absentee from these three countries?
As you know, United States always had a very intense, or you can say heavy, involvement with the Latin America, which under the Monroe Doctrine was America's backyard. And throughout the years, United States had a very heavy involvement in supporting many dictatorships in South America and Central America. But during the Bush years, of course, the United States only had eyes for Iraq and sort of more or less ignored Latin America. And today, as you know, China has a very heavy involvement with most countries in Latin America. And due to the exclusion of several countries, we have this controversy, which was really, I think, quite unnecessary to show the American leadership and unity. But so several leaders have not been very kind to the exclusion of several of the Latin American leaders. Now, we are seeing a move again to become, moving more left. Recently, the young President Boric of Chile and Petro may probably be the winner in Colombia. And the first time in Colombia, recent history, you will have a left-leaning president. Argentina, of course, is very closely entwined with China. And, China has been making big inroads into Latin America because of the tremendous amount of investments and trade. Here in Brazil, for example, last year, the trade surplus with China was over $40 billion, a total of about $140 billion of trade. Brazil had become one of the major suppliers of grains and animal proteins to China. So, Brazil, although the Brazilian president is very much aligned with Donald Trump, going forward, Brazil needs China really, and China also needs Brazil. So I think that it's an important alliance for the strategic alliance for the prosperity of both countries.
Yeah, business obviously is a very important investment, to people's the improving of livelihoods of their standard of living. Professor Jiang, the U.S. side, when they basically said there's no invite to the three countries, they started this intergovernment America doctrine, basically the charter. They say democracy is enshrined in the charter. But then there's issue. People would ask, why were Cuba invited for the past couple of summit, and so why now Cuba, there's not much change in Cuba. Now Cuba is not up to the standard anymore.
The U.S. always believes that Cuba is the so-called non-democratic country. So Cuba has been kept out of the door of the Americas organization, like OAS and also the Summit of the Americas. Well, Cuban leaders were invited, I think, twice, once in Panama and the other in Peru. But as you know, now the U.S. hosts the 9th summit. So the U.S. has the authority to choose who should be invited. Okay, so if this time the summit takes place in other countries, I believe Cuba will be invited. And secondly, let me say that in the past several years, when Obama was in power, so there was a very big improvement for the bilateral relationship between U.S. and Cuba. So Cuban leaders were invited twice. But now, as you know, although Biden loosed some kind of restrictions a little bit not long ago, but still, the U.S. considers Cuba as a kind of enemy. So it's logical to believe that the U.S. will not invite Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua.
Laura, if you take a look at the U.S. Foreign policy making, for example, President Biden has stressed very much about democracy versus, say, authoritarian states. Last year, there's a summit of democracies, and then now, again, democracy is standing out in terms of the gathering. So is there a concern, people would say, is there too much ideology? If we stress too much ideological differences, it's like, oh, we have different political system, we have different values, so we cannot engage with each other, we cannot do business with each other. I mean, suppose if there's a presence of Cuba, probably it's easier to talk about the problem of immigration for the US and other countries.
That's right. The presence of countries, even where there's disagreements, is what leads to a broader dialogue, which is what's necessary to resolve some of the major challenges within the region. And there is a very deep concern that this summit from the start, with the announcement, although it wasn't confirmed until the last minute, that these three countries would be excluded, was too ideological, and it was too oriented toward US politics, in the sense that part of the reason that Biden began with this announcement was that he's looking toward the midterm elections and he's concerned about the Florida vote, always a key state in which there are a number of Cuban Americans and a certain part of that group, a diminishing part of that group, is very anti the Cuban government. So he's playing to that crowd in a sense. And this really rubbed the wrong way for many leaders in Latin America who were looking forward to a policy from the Biden administration that was a little more in the lines of what the Obama administration began with. Cuba was readmitted to the Organization of American States in 2009 under the Obama administration, and Obama in the summit greeted Raul Castro. And this was a way to bring the continent together and made a strong statement about the right to self-determination among the countries. This is not the Biden policy. And we saw it in this summit, but we've been seeing it all along. There's another round of investment in so-called democracy promotion programs that seek regime change in the most extreme versions, and that seek to kind of tinker with internal politics in other countries. And we've seen a lot of statements in this regard. It's really important to keep in mind that when we talk about who's democratic and who's not democratic and who fits the OAS charter and who doesn't, there's a complete double standard as well. Biden has singled out these three left-wing countries from the very outset, and yet has not said a word about Haiti, that does not have a legitimately elected government now, and that does not live up to the charter as well. There are concerns about democracy in many other countries in the region that have more right-wing governments, and yet, as I say, these are not mentioned at the time. So this is the ideological division that Biden has made. We're seeing what looks like almost an attempt to revive an alliance of the Americas, that is to say, an alliance only among neoliberal states that has a number of objectives. One is to isolate the left-wing countries, which are now a sizable bloc, and would be very difficult to isolate them. As you mentioned, we're looking at the election in Colombia, we're looking at the election in Brazil that could make that bloc really a large part of Latin America. And the other is to block the further expansion of Chinese interests in the continent. What Latin American countries are saying regarding that, or a large part of them, is that we'll choose who we do business with. And the days of absolute Monroe Doctrine US hegemony are over. I think that's one of the messages, strong messages, that Lopez Obrador wanted to send by saying that he would not accept an exclusionary summit. And that's a message that the other countries that followed his lead have wanted to send. But it's creating a huge vacuum, especially in the agenda on immigration, because the entire Northern Triangle, which is to say Northern Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, are not sending their heads of state to the summit. So I think it'll be a summit of declarations without a lot of meat behind them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Maricruz, let's focus a little bit on that, this democracy thing. You know, the U.S. said because of lacking, not meeting the standard for democracy, so they, didn't send the invite to the three countries. But then some reporters would question the White House, like, well, at the same time, the U.S. is planning to visit, for President Biden to visit Saudi Arabia. So people are saying that at least is that the lack of consistency of U.S. foreign policy?
There has been instability for the last few years in the world, and that includes the United States. And that's affecting the consistency of their policies. We are dealing with more constraints. We are dealing with more crises. The United States has this big issue right now in their hands, the war between Ukraine and Russia. I'm not saying that they don't have more resources to deal with Latin America, but definitely it's having an impact. Now, I think the message that the United States wanted to send in this summit is that it was going to be focused on democracy, on freedom, and on security. And they thought that the three countries that were excluded do not represent those goals. I assume, that's my personal opinion, that that's why they were not invited. Now, the immigration issue that Laura was mentioning, I think we should talk about that. What's the impact that that's going to have? Most of the immigrants are coming from Latin America, whether it's Central America or South America. It's not so much with Mexico only as it was years ago, but it's coming from Venezuela, from Brazil, and of course from Central America. But what is the impact of this forum, of the immigration on the forum, on the conversations, on the positions of the presidents of the countries that are having these huge immigrations of their citizens coming to the United States, undocumented because they are not coming in, following the US laws. I think all of that is going to be talked about.
Mm-hmm. Well, Charles, do you see immigration, which is obviously one of the top concerns for Americans, in terms of their southern borders, is that also an issue of Americas, of, let's say Latin American countries?
Most countries in Latin America or South America have been facing immigration problems as well. For example, there has been a tremendous exodus of Venezuelans going to Colombia and coming to Brazil. Brazil now has a lot of Haitians who left Haiti, and they're coming to Brazil and establishing themselves in Brazil. Brazil has quite a liberal policy of accepting immigrants from other countries. There's a huge community of Syrians in Brazil. Brazil, like the United States, is a country of immigrants. But the Summit of Americas, instead of showing unity and dialogue between the different parties, has been a sign of division. It's us against them. And the problem is, when you take a look at Bolivia, Peru, Honduras, Chile, and Argentina are all left-leaning countries. And if Lula becomes president of Brazil again, of course, Brazil would become a left-leaning country as well. So I think that it's not a very wise time to create divisions rather than trying to have dialogue to unite everybody with common goals. And this emphasis on democracy is very important to President Biden. But I think that many Americans also believe that he might want to fix democracy at home before being such a mission, trying to convince the world that the American style democracy would be the best. I think that today, United States democracy is a bit dysfunctional.
Yes, Laura, speak of that, speak of the division, the democracy here, and the summit. Obviously, Mexican President Obrador has made it official that he will boycott it, skip this summit, and together with other countries, Honduras included. What do you make of that in terms of the U.S. influence in the region? Some say, oh, that's a weakening of the U.S. influence. Countries, quite a number of countries are basically saying no to the way the U.S. handled this gathering. From
a perspective of decolonizing, which is a goal of the United Nations and of the world in a formal sense, U.S. influence in many senses should be diminishing. What we want to see is respect for self-determination. And I think we are seeing that it is diminishing in many senses with this decision, especially by Mexico. There was a tremendous amount of pressure from the Biden administration on Mexico. We've seen innumerable, practically, diplomats coming down to pressure him, phone calls, all levels. Senator Dodd, Biden's representative, the vice president, there's been a tremendous amount of pressure because Biden really felt that the physical presence of Lopez Obrador in the summit was critical to the success of it. And he lost on that. And that also becomes not just a kind of a political win in terms of taking an independent stand from the government of Mexico, but it's also a way of asserting these new spaces and initiatives that are happening in the continent that are reviving in some ways because they have been around for a while, which is, for example, strengthening the South-South ties within the continent that give them greater leverage against the asymmetry of power that's represented by the United States when we talk about the Americas. For example, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, called CELAC by its Spanish initials, is one of the important spaces that the Mexican government and other of the left-leaning governments have been trying to fortify in this sense. That begins to change the relationship of power within the continent, and I think in a positive way because it creates more space for national sovereignty among the smaller countries that are able to unite and look at relationships among themselves that could be far less controlled than the bilateral relationships with the United States. So is US power diminishing? Perhaps. I think that it does when you have these left-wing governments that come to power and they want to take a different path. And I think that this is important and positive at this time, because when we look specifically at the Biden agenda for this summit, what they're putting out there in terms of both solutions for economic issues and for immigration issues are not positive for our region. The economics is the same as we've been seeing in the past, the imposition of mega projects, opening up markets to transnational investment. And those are some of the factors that have deepened inequality, have deepened poverty, and have displaced people, forcing migration from many of these countries. So if we continue on this path of more of the same, we're likely to see the very problems that they're seeking to solve intensify in the future. It's time for new solutions.
Yeah, Professor Jiang, speak of the relationship between Latin American countries and the U.S. Of course, the U.S. is the largest country, most powerful country. But at the same time, there's a principle of sovereignty. Countries being equal, whether they are large and small. There's a necessary respect for sovereignty, despite their political systems or differences over there. But it seems to me like the expectations also very different. For the U.S., probably very important for immigration issue because that's to their heart. But for a lot of Latin American countries, it's really about they're looking forward to more investment, more trade and more development, which probably can help us, to solve these root causes of immigration issue here.
Yes, as you mentioned, that the so-called migration issue is the most complicated issue for the U.S.-Latin America relationship, as far as I can understand. There are so many migrants going from Central America or South America to the U.S.-Mexico border. Some of the people even go to the borders on foot. So it's really hard to understand how they can reach the U.S.-Mexico border. And that's why Trump wanted to build a wall, and the wall is almost half completed. Well, I would say that the U.S. needs cheap labor from Latin America. And Latin America need a US dollar. So every year, many countries get the so-called US dollar remittance. And this amount of remittance is even bigger than foreign investment for some countries in Central America. So if the US and Latin America can deal with this migration issue in a nice way, well, that will be a win-win. But very sorry to see that these migrants are not treated in a nice way. The US always say it's human rights protection is the best. But how does the US treat these Latin American migrants in a very, very terrible way.
China has become the top trading partner for a few Latin American countries in this region, and that's said to be one of the concerns for the US to engage with this region more closely. But in a way, China's investment probably has prompted Washington to do more, to engage more closely with the regional countries.
Yes, I think that is one of the motivations for having a closer relationship. Right now, we already know the details of what they've announced in terms of Central America. They've announced $3.2 billion in private sector investment for the very reason that my colleagues were mentioning, that the United States economy is not in a position to give out a lot in foreign aid at this point because of the pandemic crisis and because of all its other commitments abroad and to its own people. What we're seeing when we look closely at what they've announced in terms of these packages of support to Northern Central America is that they're rehashing some funds that were already appropriated in the past and repackaging them to present them as a new form of support, which happens a lot. But then also that it's heavily weighted toward investments in the private sector. Now, in Honduras and these other countries that we've been watching closely for a long time, when we look at many of those projects of private sector investment, what we're seeing is that they're not truly benefiting the countries in which they're implanted. They are, in many cases, causing conflicts over land and displacing people, actually contributing to migration. In other cases, they're contributing to a situation of very cheap and exploited labor that in the end, they could say that they offered so many jobs, but then in the end, they're not the quality jobs. They're not the kinds of jobs that really feed a healthy economy. So that we have to look closely at what this private investment means when we're talking about the new coalition of MasterCard, Visa, Microsoft, PepsiCo. These are some of the big corporations that are at the center of this $3.2 billion effort. That's really one of the problems. And then, of course, the United States could do something very simple that would really help development, which is to start forgiving debt. Again, in the case of Honduras, under the narco dictatorship of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's now been indicted in the United States for drug trafficking, Honduras incurred a large debt with the United States, much of it for military and police equipment to fight the war on drugs, which actually ended up expanding drug trafficking through the country because this is a failed model throughout the region. If the United States were to forgive some of that debt, Honduras would be in a much better position to get on its feet and begin to improve the economy in order to create jobs that would keep people at home. Because again, everyone is completely right. We've talked to hundreds of migrants coming up here through Mexico, that these people don't choose to leave their homes. They're forced out of their homes by either economic conditions or by the violence that's taken hold of the countries under poor governments and also under many of the militarized security policies of the United States.
Well, with that, we come to the end for today's discussion. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xi Qingduo. Many thanks to our guests. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.